All right, I bring in Mike Silver on a day full of news. Let's start with Brian Flores suing multiple people from, as far as I can tell, the Giants, the Dolphins. It includes a Bill Belichick letter. He's suing the NFL. My first takeaway is it's a little scorched earth. He probably would acknowledge not that it would be a career ender, but it will limit some opportunities going forward if you are a litigious person. That scares some people off. But I always thought the Rooney Rule is a little shammy to begin with. What's your takeaway on the Flores lawsuits?
Yeah, Colin, it looks like he snapped, and I can understand and appreciate why any black coach would snap given the overall backdrop of coaching and race in the NFL that I've witnessed in my 33 years covering this league, and before that as a consumer. It's just, there are so many instances where it just doesn't seem fair on a systemic level. And this particular coaching cycle has not gone well. And then if you look at the allegations in this lawsuit, it looks like he experienced some pretty frustrating things on a personal level. There's the text from Bill Belichick that was going to Brian Daboll, but instead went to Brian Flores. Wow. That seemed to indicate that Brian Daboll had the Giants job locked up 3 days before Flores was interviewing. So I think as these things compound, it just starts to feel like it's not a level playing field. And somebody finally snapped to the point where, as you said, he filed a lawsuit that will be certainly frowned upon by prospective employers in this industry. But make no mistake, there are a lot of black coaches that will find this to be heroic. And look, it just hasn't been a good stretch for the NFL in terms of race, including the race norming part of the concussion lawsuit, which hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And I would encourage people to search engine that and do a little more research. But maybe one of the more abominable things I've seen, and that's not just on the NFL, the Players Association signed off on that settlement too. It's since been rectified after attention was drawn to it, but just it hasn't been a great run. And meanwhile, you have a league that has end racism, and it takes all of us in the end zone and on helmets. And it's going to be a great halftime show that appeals to the urban demographic. It's a crazy time for this to hit the NFL. And I, having worked at the NFL for as long as I did, 8 years with NFL Network, I know that they are flipping out both in that Los Angeles NFL media headquarters and in the league office on Park Avenue in New York.
Do we believe an African-American coach will be hired in this cycle?
I believe that if you're a team that has not yet hired a coach and you were planning to not hire an African-American coach, you are now thinking about how bad it looks in a different way in the wake of this lawsuit. Now, maybe that won't actually impact the decisions, but not only has it been a rough cycle so far coach-wise for diversity, we have had two very promising young black GMs who've been hired, which is cool, and that's progress. But, it's kind of looking like it's not going to go great with Josh McCown maybe getting Houston, and that's offensive to a lot of white coaches too. I don't want to just put that in the race box. Someone with zero coaching experience getting an NFL head coaching job should offend virtually any coach with experience. But we've seen Matt Eberflus, Jonathan Gannon's getting a lot of run. I think Kevin O'Connell very well may be headed for a job. Mike McDaniel, who is biracial, may have a shot at Miami, but it's not looking awesome. And so I don't know, will this impact what actually happens in the cycle? Tell you one thing, if I were Roger Goodell, I'd be working the phones right now to the owners who haven't yet made hires and saying, hey, anything you could do to help us from a global standpoint right now wouldn't hurt, because we look real bad.
Well, I think what really hurts the NFL, Brian Flores won 8 of 9 with Tua and 10 games with Ryan Fitzpatrick and Tua. And both of us from various sources heard that Flores, and this has become a Patriot trend, can be difficult. His interpersonal skills, not very redeeming, fired multiple offensive coordinators. Okay, fine. And I suspect Flores would get another job, although sometimes, Doug Peterson, by the way, it may take a couple years,
Right.
It's, by the way, there's not many great jobs out there. The Raiders is considered the best job, and it's one of the worst ownership situations and the toughest division in football. So I always thought Flores would get another job. He probably need to kind of look in the mirror a little bit in his interpersonal skills, which, by the way, Matt Patricia, Josh McDaniels, Charlie Weiss.
Yeah.
I think
I'd put Greg Schiano in that because he's kind of from that same camp.
Yeah. But when you came on our podcast, I thought, I wouldn't say you took the side, but you understood the Flores. After you did some deep diving, you did understand Flores' dismissal in Miami, I felt.
Yeah, and I think you put it really well. A lot of times, black or white, when we see people get fired in a very surprising way in the NFL, when I really dig deep, I find that relations, and particularly managing the relationship with ownership, tends to be the thing we're missing. And I would put John Dorsey, for example. He was a successful general manager in Kansas City, seemingly, and he's white, and abruptly he was gone. Seemed to be, from what I gathered, that he wasn't doing a great job of keeping ownership in the loop and giving them a sense of what was, important to them. So I think Flores would fall into that camp. And look, he's a young coach, and certainly let's not ignore the New England part of it. You put that very, very well. But yeah, I when he was fired, that kind of made sense to me because of that, though I think we would all have agreed, like, won a lot of games. As you said, it's pretty weird firing. But listen, not to personalize, I've been accused quite recently by good friends of personalizing everything. But, I recently moved on from a job that I had for 8 years and am now trying to figure out my situation. And I know that I was very frustrated by the way my last job ended at NFL Network, and that remains frustrating to me. But as I've gone through it, not being in that job and the outcome of that has frustrated me much less than some of the things that I felt have happened since then when I've been on the market. And so if that's what Brian Flores maybe's gone through in the last couple of weeks, and that's what got him to snap, I can understand, because, okay, yeah, the Dolphins, it was weird, and it's ridiculous in my mind that I was fired with that record, but maybe I just had a bad relationship with ownership or whatever with the general manager. But really, now you're going to make me do a song and dance interview for a job with the New York Giants that I found out from Bill Belichick? If you believe Bill Belichick, it's already in the bag for Brian Daboll. And there are some other damning things in that lawsuit. Again, we'll see what the evidence is, but he says that he did an interview with the Broncos in 2019 that was effectively, in his mind, a sham interview. He said that John Elway and others showed up an hour late and, in his opinion, seemed to be hungover. And, that, I'm sure, felt like a system that wasn't, geared toward his potential benefit or level playing field. There's a charge in there that I think the most damning thing in there, if again, we'll see what the evidence is, but he says that Dolphins owner Stephen Ross did some things, including either offered him $100,000 a loss when he wanted him to tank, or actually gave him that. I have to read it a little more closely. He accuses Ross of trying to engineer this meeting with Flores and a unnamed prominent quarterback who was property of another team over the offseason, where they would just happen to meet, and Flores found out about it and left. I mean, there's some things in there that, go beyond the systemic racism part of it and are just plain, damning to the people named. And so it's a bombshell that dropped, but I think we're going to be watching this over the coming weeks and months, and in a way that we felt we might with the Washington Dan Snyder investigation and emails that as of now we've only seen a tiny slice of.
Yeah, I am never surprised when billionaires do shady things. I mean, I hate to say it, but I have heard so many stories through the years, ridiculous stories from owners in the NFL, from coaches, day before a game demanding they change the game plan. I've heard that twice. Having to waste 2 hours talking an owner off a ledge when your job, the team you took over, was 1-15, and he can't believe you can't compete with Ray Lewis's Ravens the following year. So, I mean, when I read some of the Brian Flores stuff, I'm like, yeah, what a shock that. And I've said this before. We always say there's about 7 great quarterbacks in the league. There's about 7 great owners in the league.
Yeah,
seriously.
Great point. Well, you're talking to the person who did owner rankings annually for both SI.com and Yahoo Sports. And then I know this is going to shock you, but when I went to NFL Network, I stopped doing the owner rankings because they were very, not only detailed, but very personalized. I said things about owners that they weren't used to hearing and didn't like to hear, not just about their ownership style, but their personal style. I stopped when I was an NFL employee. I suspect those will resurface shortly. And they will, I won't hold back, but you're right. I always said when I started doing owner rankings, you would think in a competitive industry like this with egos, and by the way, a guaranteed profit, you would think there'd be 32, people out there who were like, I will do anything to give my team a chance and support it. And you're right. I mean, 7 might be a little more than 7, but it's not more than 12. It's somewhere in that 7 to 12 zone, depending on how you and I would parse it. Yeah, maybe there's a way you and I could turn this into just my wheels are spinning, into a visual and audio presentation too, because I love doing it in print, but there's a lot to say about all 32.
Yeah, it's my initial reaction to Brian Flores is, what the hell? Then I made 2 calls, people I trust, and I'm like, yeah, it's the Patriot paradigm again with lousy people skills.
Yeah.
But God, you win 8 or 9 games with Tua, you're gonna get another job. By the way, where are we on Eric Bieniemy? Is he interviewing for any of these jobs?
Right. He had one interview with the Broncos. I actually did talk to Broncos general manager George Payton because I'm very interested. And he said, I said that, he's been accused of not interviewing well in the past. And he said, no, he interviewed very, very well. Bieniemy did. He said he was a very good interview. Basically, a cynic would then say, and I think I probably asked, well, why wasn't he one of your finalists? But before I could even ask, if I remember the conversation correctly, he answered the question. And the answer was, I was blown away by Nathaniel Hackett and Kevin O'Connell, who I believe were the 2 finalists. They named Dan Quinn as the 3rd one. But I think the way he termed it to me was that Eric had a really good interview. But look, when people say, I mean, listen, everyone wants to litigate each one individually, and I can, going back to Sherm Lewis and Ray Rhodes, and I could do it every year, every cycle, every instance, but it is a global phenomenon. But in terms of Bieniemy, one thing that frustrates him and other black coaches and other people who are paying attention is that, Andy Reid had Doug Peterson as his non-play calling offensive coordinator. Doug Peterson got a job. Matt Nagy succeeded him. He was the non-play calling offensive coordinator. He got a job. Eric Bieniemy became the non-play calling offensive coordinator. Got even better. And now it's like, nah, don't want him. And people say, well, he hasn't called his own plays. I'm like, yeah, he's the exact same as the other 2, in terms of his job. And he's got Andy Reid publicly, and I know privately, pounded the table and saying, this guy will be a great head coach. Doesn't mean he will, but Andy Reid thinks so. So, Jim Caldwell has been a frustrating one. Look what he did in Detroit. Look what's happened before and since. And look, I know people like to lampoon this, but I'm very, very close with Hue Jackson. I understand much more about what was really going on in Cleveland and what some of his unique challenges were. And if Hue were right here next to me, I would say, you did a lot of it yourself, buddy. Some of your bad qualities came out in a stressful situation. And when you lose, you get fired. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that happened to him that were not very fair, in my opinion. I'm sure some of them will be coming out before too long. And I also know that it ruined his career. This is a guy who had one season in Oakland when it was 8-8 and got screwed after Al Davis died. Mark took over. Hue got fired, gutted his way back after being an assistant special teams coach and working all the way back up, got another chance due to his great work with Andy Dalton. And, partly of his own making and partly because of the position he was placed in, his career was essentially ended. And I know too much about it. That's not fair either. There's just a lot of things that haven't been fair. And again, I know white coaches that are being screwed too. Don Martindale would be one that comes to mind, in my opinion. I think he's been a great coordinator. I think he should be a head coach. So I'm not just putting every single thing through the racial lens, but systemically, it has not been fair. And I understand why someone like Brian Flores would get fed up and just say, you know what, I'm doing it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a reason Mike Tomlin got very agitated when he was asked about college. And he said, would you ask Sean Payton that? And
Right.
I think the message was very clear. Although it was framed like a compliment,
Right.
Mike Tomlin is the Super Bowl winning coach of the Steelers.
Right.
And we would not even for a minute think an Andy Reid or a Sean Payton would go to the college level. So I'm somebody that tries to be fair, but I don't think any reasonable person can look at what's happening and not say, all right,
Yeah.
come on, let's be honest about this. I mean, let me ask you, because Brian Flores is pretty damn intense. Name the last non-black coach who won 8 of 9 games and was fired.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, it just doesn't happen.
The only parallel is Harbaugh in that he was so successful and Jim Harbaugh was such a pain and was so good. What Jim Harbaugh did, I don't want to discount. He took over in a lockout year, where you can't be with your players over the offseason, a losing team, and they were in the NFC Championship game hosting it and went to overtime that first year. And then Super Bowl, and then NFC Championship game, narrow defeat. And then he had a not great year and was basically fired. Now, it's the same thing as Brian Flores. I understand why Jed York was done with Jim Harbaugh.
Yeah.
I get it. And I would have had no problem with him making that decision. I just think the problem is if you bring in Jim Tomsula, you have to answer for that. But if you fired Jim Harbaugh and brought in Kyle Shanahan, it probably would have, been okay. So it's not an absolute, but you're right. It is there. There are too many inconsistencies when you compare the two over too much time that you can't. If you're fair, you got to say it's not great. And the last thing I would say is, fans like to weigh in on this stuff all the time. I speak to coaches every day, and especially black coaches, but other coaches who aren't black and personnel people tell me these things too. But if you think that they're just putting their heads down and going, it's not, Mike Silver just plays the race card and Colin, but really we're just, they think about this all the time. They think it's unfair. I've seen people leave the business because they just couldn't take it anymore. Good coaches, and they know it's unfair. And so I'm trying when I get loud about this to speak for them.